When a person breaks a bone, the physical pain is intense, but there is usually this strange psychological relief the moment the doctor slaps the X-ray onto the light board.
Right, because you can finally see it.
Yeah, you look at the film and there it is. A jagged, glowing white line right across the fibula. The doctor points to it with a pen, gives it a Latin name, and tells you how many weeks you will spend in a cast.
The problem is totally visible.
It is. It's measurable. You can put a physical boundary around the damage and walk out of the hospital with a clear, linear plan for recovery. We find that kind of biological certainty very comforting.
It is comforting because, well, the physical body obeys the laws of physics and biology. You diagnose a fracture, you set the bone, you let it heal. The protocol is standard, and the enemy is obvious.
But the moment you step out of the hospital and into the landscape of the human soul, that clarity completely vanishes.
Oh, absolutely.
There are no X-rays for human motivations. There are no lab tests to tell you why your affections have suddenly grown cold or, why an idle thought suddenly morphs into an obsession. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. The internal life does not operate on a simple binary of healthy versus unhealthy.
No, it really doesn't.
It operates in the shadows. It is characterized by mixed motives, self-deception, and many hidden vulnerabilities.
And that is why we are here today. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. You, the listener, are sitting right here in the room with us as our silent third participant for this deep dive. Today, our mission is to dissect a theological masterpiece written in 1658 by the English theologian John Owen.
Such a brilliant text.
It really is. We are unpacking the intricate anatomy of spiritual snares and seductions. We want to look closely at how these things operate behind the scenes in the human mind and uncover how a person actually guards their soul.
To grasp what John Owen is doing in this text, you have to understand the specific air he was breathing at the time. The historical context is everything.
Right. Set the stage for us.
Well, the year is 1658. Owen is writing during a period of massive, almost whiplash-inducing social change for his particular group, the Puritans. For decades, they had been a heavily persecuted minority. They were fined, imprisoned, and sometimes physically mutilated by the state church.
Just horrific conditions.
Yeah, they lived in what Owen called a low place. Their religion was something that cost them everything.
Which, when you are hiding in a barn just to hold a worship service, your faith tends to stay pretty sharp. The threat is outside the door, and everyone inside the room knows what is at stake.
Spot on. The persecution acted as a purifying fire. But then the English Civil War happens. The political winds shift dramatically.
The Puritans win.
They do. Suddenly, the formerly persecuted minority becomes the political and cultural establishment. They gain the favor of the state. They ascend to the mountains of societal influence.
Wow, total flip.
It was. Owen himself becomes the vice-chancellor of Oxford University, walking the halls of absolute academic and political privilege.
On paper, this sounds like the absolute victory. They prayed for relief from persecution, and they got it. They hold the reins of culture.
You would think it was the golden age of their movement. But Owen looked around Oxford, he looked at his fellow ministers and students, and he was terrified by what he saw.
Aye.
Because that shift from the valleys of persecution to the peaks of cultural approval led directly to heavy spiritual lethargy. When faith no longer costs you your livelihood, the zeal evaporates.
The pressure was off.
Right. Owen saw his peers becoming entangled in worldliness, obsessed with academic titles, comfortable livings, and societal applause. He realized the greatest threat was no longer the political enemy holding a sword outside the city gates. The lethal threat was the creeping, comfortable complacency taking root inside the city walls.
This historical backdrop sets the stakes for our deep dive today. What happens when the pressure is off? Our mission here is to dissect the critical difference between being tested by God and being entangled by a snare.
Which is a vital distinction.
We are going to analyze why human defenses, like our willpower, our intellect, our reputation, fail so miserably when the internal pressure rises. And we will lay out the timeless, gospel-centered strategies this text provides for preserving the soul.
The basis of this entire discussion begins with a razor-sharp distinction between a neutral testing and a malicious seduction to sin. The text insists that we must separate what God is doing from what the enemy is doing.
God tests individuals, but God never seduces individuals to evil.
That is right.
Let's break that down. Because the word test can sound incredibly negative in our modern vocabulary. We think of pop quizzes and failure rates. But the text frames God's testing differently.
When God initiates a trial or a test, the primary design is revelation. It is to reveal what is hidden inside the human heart.
Because we don't know our own hearts.
We are notoriously blind to our own internal state. The omniscient God already knows what is in the heart, of course, but the individual believer usually does not. A test forces the internal reality to the surface so the individual can actually see it.
Okay, that makes sense.
The text uses two distinct, brilliant biblical narratives to illustrate this: Abraham and Hezekiah.
The story of Abraham is probably the most famous and frankly the most agonizing. God commands Abraham to take his son Isaac up the mountain and sacrifice him.
Which is just intense.
It is a command that seems to contradict everything God had previously promised about building a nation through that specific child.
It is an excruciating, incomprehensible command from a human perspective. But the text points out that God brings the specific, agonizing test to reveal the sheer strength of Abraham's faith.
God draws it out.
Yes, he draws out that faith. So Abraham himself and all of history reading the account can see his absolute, unflinching dependence on the Lord. The text refers to this as a display of renewing grace.
So God is sustaining him through it.
Precisely. God is actively working in Abraham to sustain him through the trial, and the trial validates the immense work God has already done in his soul.
So in Abraham's case, the test revealed gold. It revealed a structural integrity that held up under the most extreme weight imaginable. But the second narrative, the story of King Hezekiah, goes in a completely different direction.
Hezekiah's story is fascinating because the test doesn't look like a hardship at all. It looks like a massive diplomatic success.
Oh, interesting.
Hezekiah is the king of Judah, and he receives an incredibly flattering visit from the ambassadors of Babylon. They come bearing gifts, congratulating him on his recent recovery from a severe illness.
And what does God do in this moment?
The biblical account says God left him. God stepped back and withdrew his conscious, sustaining presence for a moment, leaving Hezekiah entirely to his own devices.
Just stepping back to see what happens.
To reveal the hidden pride swelling in Hezekiah's heart. Without God actively restraining him, Hezekiah immediately starts strutting around, showing these pagan ambassadors all of his wealth, his silver, his gold, and his armories. He takes all the glory for himself.
He utterly fails the test. He flexes his geopolitical muscles instead of giving glory to the God who literally just healed him from a terminal illness.
He fails spectacularly, but the text points out that God does this to display preventing grace.
We need to define that term for the modern ear. What is preventing grace in this context?
Preventing grace is the hidden hand of God that constantly holds back our worst inclinations. It is the grace that prevents us from ruining ourselves on a daily basis.
Oh, I see.
By stepping back momentarily, God shows Hezekiah and us our absolute terrifying weakness when we are left alone. Hezekiah needed to see that his natural default setting, without God's constant intervention, was arrogant idolatry.
So the test was necessary for his own self-knowledge. So God's testing is essentially a diagnostic stress test. It is meant to show the structural integrity of the soul, whether that reveals the gold of faith like in Abraham or the hidden cracks of pride like in Hezekiah, so it can be addressed.
That is a great way to summarize it.
But here's where the contrast becomes stark. The enemy's seduction is not a structural assessment. The goal is sheer demolition. The enemy's snare aims strictly at producing sin and destroying the individual.
And the source material is very specific about the avenues the enemy uses to accomplish this demolition. There are three primary channels. First, direct whispers.
What does that mean practically?
This is when the enemy injects blasphemous, dark, or evil thoughts directly into the mind, completely unprompted by anything in the environment. Second, the allurements of the external world.
Like what?
These are the shiny, culturally approved things that catch our eye and promise satisfaction. And third, the treachery of human corruption, our own indwelling sin.
I want to look closely at that third channel, the internal corruption. Because the text uses the narrative of Judas Iscariot to illustrate how this lethal combination works. Judas is a chilling case study.
Judas is the quintessential example of the external bait perfectly matching the internal flaw. Judas had a documented internal corruption, which was covetousness. He loved money.
Right, he was the treasurer.
The biblical accounts tell us he was the treasurer for the disciples and frequently skimmed from the money bag. That was his internal vulnerability.
The religious leaders didn't have to convince Judas to be greedy. They didn't have to teach him how to love silver. The internal rot was already there, festering in secret.
All the enemy had to do was present the external bait that corresponded perfectly to the internal rot. The world offered 30 pieces of silver. The external allurement met the internal covetousness, and the explosion was catastrophic.
Wow.
The enemy saw the match, struck the match, and Judas betrayed the Son of God.
I think of the human heart like a heavily fortified, ancient walled city. The enemy is outside, representing the world, the culture, the external
The
allurements.
massive army at the gates.
Yeah, and that enemy army outside could batter the massive stone walls for decades and have zero success breaking in. The walls are too thick. But the horrific reality of the human condition is that there is a traitor living inside the city.
The indwelling sin.
That's right. That traitor is our indwelling sin, our own corrupt nature. The external siege only works because the internal traitor is standing by the gates, eager to lower the drawbridge the second the enemy knocks.
That framing captures the theology perfectly. The external temptation has no leverage unless there is a corresponding appetite within. The traitor inside is already negotiating the terms of surrender before the enemy even brings up the siege engines.
This psychological reality brings us directly to a specific phrase the text unpacks from the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus tells his disciples in Matthew 26.41 to watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation.
A very specific command.
The source material clarifies a crucial distinction here. Believers will always face testing in this life. You cannot avoid the enemy knocking on the gates. You cannot stop the world from existing. The mortal danger does not lie in the presence of the temptation. It lies in the entanglement. The danger is in the entering in.
To enter in is to voluntarily walk to the gates and start talking to the enemy. Entanglement occurs the moment a person begins to parley with the sin. You stop viewing the temptation as a hostile threat and start viewing it as a negotiation.
Like you're having a conversation with it.
Yes, you begin to argue in its defense within your own mind.
What does that internal parlaying actually sound like? Give me the vocabulary of a mind that is starting to enter a snare.
It sounds like rationalization. The text notes that the mind starts entertaining extenuating thoughts. You say things like, "Is it not a little one?" You tell yourself that this specific instance is an exception to the rule.
We do that all the time.
Constantly. You make excuses about your unique circumstances. You tell yourself you are tired, you are stressed, you deserve a break, nobody will know, you will repent tomorrow. The moment you start acting as the defense attorney for the sin that is trying to destroy you, you have entered into the temptation.
You stop arresting the traitor inside the city, and instead, you invite him to sit at the council table and hear out his proposals.
That is the actual shift. You lose your posture of decisive resistance. And when that resistance falls, you are dragged toward what the text, referencing Revelation 3.10, calls the hour of temptation. This is a fascinating, terrifying concept.
The hour. It sounds ominous.
The hour is the high noon of a trial. It is the moment when the temptation reaches its absolute suffocating peak. It is not necessarily a literal 60 minutes. It is a season of maximum intensity where the snare tightens completely around the mind and the affections.
What does the psychology of that hour feel like for the person trapped inside it?
The author describes it as a state of restless urgency. It gives the soul absolutely no rest. It dominates the waking thoughts. And it achieves this dominance through a lethal combination of two psychological forces.
Sure.
Fear, which the text calls affrightment, and desire, which it calls allurement.
Fear and desire working together. That seems almost contradictory. Usually we run away from things we fear and we run toward things we desire. How do they collaborate in a snare?
They act like the two jaws of a vice. Desire pulls you toward the illicit act, offering immense pleasure or relief. At the very same time, fear pushes you forward, convincing you that if you do not comply or if you try to back out now, the consequences will be disastrous.
So you're trapped between the two.
When those two forces clamp down on a person simultaneously, the pressure is immense. The mind snaps under the weight.
The text cites the narrative of King David as the absolute case study of this specific hour. David's sin with Bathsheba and the subsequent murder of Uriah. It is probably the most chilling sequence of events in the historical books of the Old Testament because it shows how fast a giant of the faith can plummet.
David's story perfectly maps onto this anatomy of a snare. It begins with idle time and an unguarded gaze. He sees Bathsheba from his roof. That is the allurement. The desire is ignited. He acts on that desire, abusing his massive authority to summon her. The initial sin is committed, but then the situation shifts drastically.
She sends word that she is pregnant.
Precisely. Now, the second force hits, affrightment, fear. The desperate, suffocating fear of exposure, scandal, and the potential political fallout. David realizes he cannot hide the pregnancy because Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, has been away at war. The vice closes.
So David tries to manipulate the situation. He calls Uriah back from the front lines, hoping Uriah will go home to his wife and cover up the paternity. But Uriah is too honorable. He refuses to sleep in his comfortable bed while his fellow soldiers are sleeping in the dirt. Uriah's honor highlights David's utter corruption.
And this is where the hour reaches its lethal peak. David's intense desire to keep his reputation, combined with his frantic fear of discovery, leads him to orchestrate a premeditated murder. He sends Uriah back to the front lines with his own death warrant in his hand.
It's just devastating.
The snare brought a man described as after God's own heart to his knees, turning him into an adulterer and a murderer in a matter of weeks. David was fully entangled, the drawbridge was down, the city was taken, and the king was taking direct orders from the enemy.
Looking at David's collapse makes me question the prevailing mindset we see all the time today. There's this pervasive casual arrogance in modern culture. People constantly say, I can handle this. I know my limits. I can watch this. I can participate in this. I can hang out in this environment and it won't affect me.
That mindset is everywhere.
I have to pose a direct question to you, the listener. If spiritual titans like Adam, in a perfect environment, Abraham on the mountain and David at the height of his kingship, were severely bruised, compromised, and brought to ruin by temptation, why would anyone sitting here today assume they possess the fortitude to toy with sin? Why do we casually scroll past things or entertain dark thoughts for a few minutes, assuming we can just wipe our hands and walk away completely unscathed?
It is the height of human arrogance, and it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of our own internal wiring. That brings us to the folly of self-reliance, a theme the text tackles with absolute bluntness. The source material states plainly that the human heart is totally deceitful.
Totally deceitful.
Trusting your own heart or trusting your own intellect to keep you safe is not just a mistake, it is utter foolishness.
I have to stop you there, because what you just said goes against every single message pumped out by modern secular psychology and pop culture. The prevailing virtue in our society right now is follow your heart.
It's the core message of almost every movie and song.
Right, the conventional wisdom says that your heart is your truest self, your purest compass. If you just look inward and trust your feelings, you will find the right path. How do we reconcile that cultural mandate with Owen's 17th century assertion that the heart is a deceitful traitor?
You cannot reconcile them. They are completely opposite worldviews. The modern idea of following your heart assumes that the core of the human being is inherently good, neutral, or at least highly reliable.
Right, and Owen disagrees.
Reformed theology, based on the biblical text, assumes the complete opposite. It argues that the heart is fundamentally fractured by the fall. It is a factory of idols. It is prone to self-justification, bias, and blinding selfishness.
So it's broken at a systemic level.
Yes. If your compass is broken and constantly points toward a cliff, following your compass is the worst possible advice you could give to a traveler.
So trusting your emotional resolve in the face of a snare is like trusting a compass that you know is magnetized by the enemy.
It guarantees failure. The text references the Apostle Peter's arrogant boast in the upper room just hours before the crucifixion. Jesus tells the disciples they will all scatter. Peter stands up and declares, though all men forsake thee, I will not. Peter genuinely believed what he was saying.
He wasn't lying.
No, he felt a massive surge of emotional loyalty. He trusted his own emotional resolve.
He looked inward, checked his heart, saw immense affection for Jesus, and concluded he was bulletproof.
And less than 12 hours later, intimidated by a servant girl by a fire, he was calling down curses and swearing he never knew the man. His emotional resolve evaporated the moment real fear was introduced. The text also references Hazael in the Old Testament.
Tell us that story again.
The prophet Elisha looks at Hazael and begins to weep, predicting the horrific, violent atrocities Hazael will soon commit against Israel. Hazael responds with blind, offended denial. He says, "Am I a dog that I should do this thing?" He could not fathom his own capacity for evil. Both Peter and Hazael completely underestimated the treachery of their own hearts.
Let's talk about the false shields people throw up. When people realize they are facing a snare, they often rely on certain psychological or social defenses to keep themselves safe. The text critiques a few specific ones, and they are incredibly relevant today. First, there is reputation and honor. People think, I have built a good name over decades. I am a respected leader. I have a family that looks up to me. I would never risk all of that for a moment of weakness.
It sounds like a solid deterrent, but the text points out the historical reality. Even those who shine like the stars of heaven fall from grace. We see highly respected leaders, people with massive platforms, flawless reputations, and everything to lose, throwing it all away constantly. A reputation is an external construct. It cannot hold back an internal flood.
Another false shield is the fear of shame. People assume the sheer terror of public disgrace, of losing their job, of being ruined on social media will keep them in line.
The author argues this is entirely useless against secret sins. The fear of shame only governs your behavior when other people are watching. It is a social contract, not a moral compass.
Because what happens in the dark is different.
Right. If your only deterrent is getting caught, what happens when the snare guarantees anonymity? What happens when you are alone in a hotel room or sitting behind an encrypted screen? The fear of shame evaporates because the audience is gone.
The third false shield that the text identifies is false peace. This is a theological distortion. It is the presumption that because grace covers everything, the consequences of sin no longer matter. People adopt this careless, carnal living, thinking, well, God is forgiving. I am justified. This won't affect my standing with him.
It turns the beauty of grace into a license for spiritual suicide. It allows a person to drop their guard completely, assuming the safety net means they can safely jump off the cliff.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of how a snare actually overrides these defenses.
Yeah.
How does a rational person who knows the theology, who knows the consequences, end up dismantling their own life? The text explains the process, and it is a terrifying psychological breakdown.
The author details a two-step mechanical process. First, a temptation darkens the mind. It literally blinds the understanding. The mind is supposed to be the watchman on the wall, evaluating situations rationally, remembering the consequences, and holding fast to truth. But a snare throws a thick fog over the mind. You can no longer evaluate the situation objectively.
It is like a localized amnesia. You suddenly forget everything you've ever learned about the pain of regret.
That is the first step. While the mind is darkened, the second step occurs. The temptation bribes the affections. The affections are our desires, our loves, our appetites. The snare offers the affections something highly intoxicating.
So it shuts down your rational brain and inflames your raw desires simultaneously.
It acts like a spark meeting highly combustible material. And here's the terrifying part. Once the affections are bribed and won over to the sin, they rebel against the mind. The heart already wants to commit the act, so it forces the darkened mind to start working for it.
Wait, so the intellect switches sides?
Yes. The intellect stops acting as a watchman and starts acting as a defense attorney, inventing clever theological or situational justifications for what the heart has already decided to do.
That explains so much. It explains why incredibly intelligent people make bafflingly stupid choices when they are caught in a snare. Their intellect hasn't vanished. It has just been hijacked by their appetites.
And this breakdown does not just happen in isolation. The text expands the scope to discuss societal contagion. It addresses the severe danger of bad examples among professing Christians. A little leaven ruins the whole lump.
I see this constantly. Believers watch their peers, their pastors, or their friends engage in fleshy compromises. Maybe they see a respected leader stretching ethical boundaries in a business deal, or speaking with absolute vitriol on social media, or indulging in highly questionable entertainment. And the individual watches that and says, well, if they are doing it and they are okay, then my standards must be too rigid.
They use the failure of others to justify their own compliance. The community lowers its collective immunity. The author notes that this communal lethargy is so dangerous that God sometimes sends public judgments to deal with it.
Public judgments.
He references 2 Thessalonians 2.11, an incredibly sobering verse where God sends a strong delusion to judge a fruitless, careless generation. When a whole community drops its guard and refuses to love the truth, God may actually hand them over to the lie they so desperately want to believe. When the cultural defenses fall, the snare catches everyone.
I want to push back on a very common coping mechanism people use here. When confronted with these warnings, the immediate reaction is often to look backward at our track record. We rely on our past spiritual victories. We think, I resisted that huge temptation 5 years ago. I made the hard ethical choice last month. I have a proven track record of integrity.
It's a natural instinct to look at the scoreboard.
But resting on your past reputation or your past good choices is like building a fortress out of cardboard.
It might look impressive from the outside.
It might even have the shape of a massive castle, complete with turrets and a moat. But it has no structural density. It collapses completely at the very first heavy wind. Your victory yesterday does not guarantee your safety today. You cannot fight today's siege with yesterday's arrows.
That transition leads perfectly into the diagnostic section of the text. If our cardboard fortresses are prone to collapse, how do we know if the wind is already blowing? How do you know if a snare has already breached the perimeter?
Because we need a way to spot it.
The text identifies specific observable symptoms indicating a person has already entered a snare long before any scandalous outward sin is committed.
This is crucial. The entanglement happens in the shadows months or even years before the public explosion.
Exactly. The outward action is just the final fruit of a root that has been growing in the dark.
Let's walk through these diagnostic signs. The first symptom the author identifies is secretly feeding on the matter of a snare. This is fundamentally about feeding the ego while maintaining a righteous facade.
The text cites the historical account of Jehu in the Old Testament. Jehu is a wild character. He's anointed king and given a specific mandate by God to wipe out the corrupt dynasty of Ahab.
And Jehu executes that mandate with absolute bloody efficiency. He shows tremendous zeal. He rides his chariot furiously, tearing down idols and eliminating the wicked leadership. On the surface, he looks like the absolute reformer.
But the text pulls back the curtain on his motivation. Jehu's zeal was real, but its fuel source was toxic. He invites a man named Jehonadab into his chariot and says, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord."
See my zeal, he wants an audience.
That sentence exposes the rot. His actions were commanded by God, but his actual motivation was a desperate desire for public applause. He wanted people to see how rigorous and righteous he was. He was secretly feeding his immense ego under the guise of holy obedience.
The source material gives another example that hits much closer to home for anyone who likes to study. It talks about scholars who study theology and dive deep into Scripture, strictly to gain academic praise, to win debates, and to tickle their own pride.
The action itself, studying theology, reading massive books, understanding ancient languages, is objectively good. But the diagnostic symptom appears when the scholar's internal engine is pride. They are gathering ammunition to prove they are smarter than everyone else in the room. They are secretly feeding on the matter of a snare. The very thing that should humble them, the knowledge of God, is weaponized to inflate their ego.
The second symptom is a drop in internal temperature, spiritual coldness. This manifests as formality and absolute lifelessness in worship. The machinery is running, but the engine is cold. The text uses two powerful illustrations for this. The first is the Church of Sardis from the book of Revelation.
Christ's letter to the church in Sardis contains one of the most terrifying indictments in Scripture. Thou hast a name that thou livest and art dead. They had a stellar reputation. Other churches probably looked at Sardis and admired their programs, their attendance, their outward orthodoxy.
It was a facade.
Christ, looking at the internal reality, pronounces a spiritual autopsy. They're a corpse wrapped in a nice suit.
The second illustration comes from the Song of Solomon. It pictures the spouse, representing the believer, in bed, too sleepy and indisposed to get up and open the door when her beloved knocks.
It is a picture of heavy spiritual lethargy. The affection is gone. The desire for communion is viewed as an inconvenience. This is a subtle, dangerous symptom because the outward routine of religion is completely intact.
Right, you're still doing the things.
The person is still attending services, still dropping money in the plate, still reciting the creeds, but the internal temperature has plummeted to freezing.
I want to stop and pose a direct diagnostic question to you listening right now. Think about your habits this past month. Have you noticed your private prayer life becoming entirely robotic? Are you just reciting a familiar script to check a religious box before you fall asleep?
That's a good test.
Do you open a Bible and feel absolutely nothing but a desire to get through the chapter so you can look at your phone? That coldness is not a neutral state. It is not just a passing phase or a symptom of being busy. It is a blaring, flashing alarm that a snare is already tightening around your mind.
That coldness means the internal traitor has successfully sabotaged your supply lines. You are being starved into submission without even realizing it.
So what's the third symptom?
The third symptom is highly situational. It occurs when opportunity meets flaw. This happens when a person's daily business, their routine, or their specific circumstances constantly provide opportunities that match up perfectly with their specific internal weaknesses.
Let's ground that in reality. If you have an internal struggle with greed, and your career path constantly places you in situations where you handle uncounted cash, or you can quietly skim off the top without any oversight, or you're incentivized to lie to clients to inflate a commission, Well, that is not a coincidence.
Not at all.
That is a highly engineered snare.
If your circumstances are perfectly tailored to feed your worst, most hidden inclinations, you're not just having a lucky day at work. You are walking through a spiritual minefield designed by an enemy who has studied your specific weaknesses for years.
We have looked at the symptoms. Now we need to look at the calendar. The text acts almost like a farmer's almanac, outlining 4 specific seasons that are high risk for the soul. These are the atmospheric conditions where the enemy is most likely to launch a massive assault. Season 1 is unusual prosperity.
Prosperity is historically and psychologically incredibly dangerous. The text argues that unbroken comfort hardens the heart and provides massive amounts of fuel for our lusts. It cites Agur's striking prayer in Proverbs 30. Agur prays against riches. He explicitly asks God, "Give me neither poverty nor riches, lest I be full and deny thee," and say, "Who is the Lord?"
He recognized that having too much creates a massive illusion of autonomy. You stop depending on daily bread because your pantry is overflowing.
That's right. The text also points to David again. During a season of massive military success and political stability, David looks around at his unshakable kingdom and says, "In my prosperity, I said, I shall never be moved."
Just totally overconfident.
Yeah. The moment he believed his comfort was permanent and his position was invulnerable, the foundation cracked. Prosperity removes the daily friction that keeps us relying on God.
Season 2 follows right on the heels of prosperity. The slumber of grace. This is the natural result of living in a low-friction environment. Spiritual lethargy and negligence set in.
You stop reading, you stop praying, you stop confessing, you assume everything is fine because the surface of the water is calm. But when the watchman falls asleep on the wall, disaster is literally at the door.
Season 3 is the one that completely subverts our expectations. The text identifies a season of great spiritual enjoyment as highly dangerous.
It sounds counterintuitive. Why would feeling incredibly close to God or experiencing a massive spiritual breakthrough be dangerous?
Because Satan is an opportunistic striker.
Yes, the enemy strikes immediately following intense spiritual highs because that is when the believer is most likely to drop their guard. They think they have achieved a state of permanent elevation. They think they've graduated past basic temptations.
Which is never true.
Right. The text references the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. Paul is caught up to the third heaven. He receives glorious, inexpressible revelations. It is the absolute spiritual high.
But the very next verse describes a harsh, painful grounding.
Immediately following those massive revelations, Paul is given a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me. And Paul explicitly states why this happened, lest I should be exalted above measure. The spiritual high was so high that Paul was in immediate danger of crippling spiritual pride. God allowed the buffeting to keep him tethered to the ground.
Let's visualize this. Think about mountain climbing. When you are slogging your way up the side of a mountain, your face is against the rock, your muscles are burning, and you are hyper-focused on every single handhold. You are intensely aware of the danger. But when you finally reach the peak, the summit, what do? You stand up straight. You drop your heavy gear. You pull out your camera. You relax and take in the spectacular view.
You let your guard down.
You feel like you are on top of the world. But the reality is, standing on that narrow peak is the specific place where one careless step backward while trying to take a picture leads to a 3,000-foot lethal drop. You are completely surrounded by cliffs. I have to ask you, as someone who studies these texts, how does a believer maintain any semblance of vigilance when they feel the most secure, the most spiritually elevated?
That is the core challenge of the 4th season, the season of self-confidence. The text brings us right back to Peter's fall. Maintaining vigilance requires the constant, humbling recognition that your current spiritual height is not sustained by your own balance. Lifting oneself up above others, feeling spiritually superior to the people struggling in the valley below, guarantees a painful drop.
You set yourself up for it.
The very moment you look at a moral failure in the news and think to yourself, I would never do what that person did, I am past that, you have painted a massive target on your own back.
Arrogance is the loudest dinner bell for the enemy. So we've mapped out the entire threat landscape. We've identified the anatomy of the snare, the symptoms of the infection, and the high-risk seasons when the storms are most likely to hit. Now we need the tactical countermeasures. We need the actual defense strategy.
The text bases its entire battle plan on Christ's very simple, very weighty command to watch and pray.
What are the practical, gospel-centered strategies this 17th century manual provides for preserving the soul in the 21st century?
The author outlines 5 highly specific interconnected tactics. Tactic 1 is a pursuit of rigorous self-knowledge. You have to know your own natural temper and disposition. The text asks the reader to brutally evaluate themselves. Are you naturally stubborn and contrarian? Are you easily irritated and quick-tempered?
Are you prone to melancholy and despair?
Yes. Or are you naturally a people-pleaser who craves the approval of the room?
It is a demand for psychological honesty. You cannot defend the city if you refuse to acknowledge where the walls are crumbling.
Precisely. You must know where your internal traitor resides. If your natural disposition leans toward anger, the enemy is not going to tempt you with sloth. He's going to flood your life with irritating people and frustrating delays to provoke an explosion.
He uses your specific wiring against you.
If you are naturally a people pleaser, the enemy will use the fear of man, the threat of social rejection, to make you compromise your convictions. You have to map your own fault lines.
Tactic 2 shifts from internal evaluation to external supply. The text calls it laying up gospel provisions. This means aggressively and deliberately filling your soul with a massive sense of God's love, your justification in Christ, and the massive privileges of being adopted into God's family.
The author describes this as erecting a military garrison inside the mind to protect it from adults. Think about how a garrison functions. It occupies the strategic high ground.
Right, it takes up the space.
If your mind is heavily occupied, densely populated with the staggering, unshakable reality of your adoption and justification, there is simply less empty territory for the enemy to land his troops and plant a flag. A mind filled with the gospel is highly resistant to the whispers of despair or the allurements of cheap thrills.
That leads directly into Tactic 3, which is the protocol for the moment of impact. Immediate resistance. When the very first approach of a threat happens, when the thought first enters the mind or the bait first appears, the text demands that you act faced on the cross of Christ immediately.
Immediate means zero hesitation. You do not negotiate with the thought. You do not parley. You do not ask the temptation to explain its terms. You flee instantly to Christ.
Just run.
Run. The author points to the book of Hebrews, portraying Christ as a merciful high priest who is tested in every way we are, yet without sin, and who is therefore able to provide immediate succor or relief to those who are being tested.
We have to train our minds to stop having conversations with our temptations. You cannot outdebate a snare. You just have to run to the high priest.
Tactic 4 is tied to a phrase from Revelation 3.0, keeping the word of Christ's patience. This is about establishing an immovable value system. It involves valuing the gospel as an infinite treasure of grace, holiness, liberty, and consolation.
It is an economic defense. When you genuinely value the gospel as your highest, most precious treasure, the math of temptation breaks down. The cheap plastic trinkets the enemy offers, momentary pleasure, illicit wealth, fleeting applause, lose their appeal because they cannot compete with the massive wealth of grace you already possess.
Which brings us to the fifth and final tactic. It is a harsh word, an old word, but it is the linchpin of the whole system, mortification. The text references Galatians 2.0, talking about the necessity of crucifying the heart to the world.
And get to death.
When the enemy offers a specific bait, the text references the Old Testament story of Achan, who saw a beautiful Babylonish garment and a wedge of silver in the ruins of Jericho and stole them, bringing a curse on the whole camp. The heart must have no appetite for the silver or the garment. Mortification means putting the corrupt appetite to death.
I need some massive practical clarification on this. When modern people hear the word mortification, they usually think of medieval monks hitting themselves with whips. In our daily lives, is mortification just about gritting your teeth, white-knuckling your steering wheel, and screaming no to bad things over and over until you are exhausted?
Not at all. That's a common misconception.
Or is it about something else? Is it about replacing an inferior appetite with a superior satisfaction? To me, it sounds like the difference between starving yourself versus going to a king's banquet and eating so much prime rib that you physically cannot stomach the idea of fighting a stray dog for scraps in a dumpster behind the restaurant.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. White-knuckling is behavioral modification, and it only works for a very short time before your willpower battery runs completely dry. Mortification, as John Owen describes it here and in his other works, is starving the corrupt appetite by feasting heavily on the gospel.
Feasting on the good things.
There's a famous concept by a later Scottish minister, Thomas Chalmers, called the expulsive force of a new affection. You do not get the air out of a glass by trying to suck it out. You get the air out by pouring water in.
Oh, that's a great image.
When your soul is genuinely satisfied with the King's banquet, when you are tasting the love, grace, and absolute security of God, the dumpster scraps of the world's allurements naturally become repulsive to you. You say no to the snare, not because you are relying on your iron willpower, but because your appetite is already full of something infinitely better.
So to pull all of these heavy threads together as we land the plane, we have been looking at a masterclass in the anatomy of spiritual snares. The massive takeaway is that the primary threat is not the external bait shimmering in the world. The lethal threat is the internal traitor living in our own chest.
The one we so often ignore.
Right. The catastrophic failures happen when we drop our guard in times of comfort, when we rely on the cardboard fortresses of our past successes, or when we fall asleep during the high-risk seasons of prosperity and spiritual elevation. The absolute non-negotiable necessity here is vigilance. We have to map our own weaknesses, garrison our minds with the promises of the gospel, and actively starve our corrupt appetites by constantly feasting on the massive provisions of Christ.
It is a remarkably sobering, almost terrifying assessment of our human vulnerability. But it does not leave us in despair. It provides a clear, actionable, historically proven defense strategy based entirely on relying on the boundless grace of God rather than the brittle strength of the self.
As you step back out into the noise of your week, I want to leave you with one final, weighty thought to mull over. We spend so much time guarding our obvious weaknesses, the sins we know we struggle with. But based on everything we have unpacked today, consider this. What if the very areas where you feel the most spiritually secure right now, the theological knowledge you take the most pride in, the disciplines you think you have completely mastered, well, what if those are the specific blind spots where the enemy is quietly setting up his next snare?
It's a sobering thought.
Let that stark reality strip away your self-confidence today, and let it drive you back to total, joyful dependence on Christ's preserving grace. Because when you step into the world of the soul, that standard medical x-ray machine is broken. The diagnostic waters are incredibly murky. But we have a better tool in this truth, and a far better physician to rely on.